What happens when a war hero takes the stage to honor the fallen but ends up moving the most unexpected person in the room to tears? No one saw this coming. Stay with us, because this story will leave you speechless. The Beverly Wilshire Hotel in Los Angeles had never looked more dazzling. The grand ballroom shimmered under the golden glow of crystal chandeliers, casting soft reflections off polished marble floors and intricately set tables draped in the finest linen. The air carried the rich aroma of seared filet mignon and aged wine, mingling with the quiet hum of conversation and the occasional clinking of champagne flutes. It was the Freedom and Honor Gala, an annual event attended by the country's most powerful figures. Senators, Hollywood elites, Fortune 500 CEOs, and decorated military leaders filled the room, all gathered to support wounded veterans. They had attended plenty of galas before fundraisers where checks were written, speeches were made, and handshakes were exchanged. But tonight would be different. Before we dive into this incredible story, let us know where are you watching from. And if you love powerful stories that inspire and make you think, hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss tomorrow's episode. It's going to be unforgettable. At the front of the room, the long, elevated stage stood as the night's focal point, framed by deep blue velvet curtains. Behind it, a massive American flag hung proudly, its stars catching the light each time the fabric rippled slightly from the air vents above. It was a setting designed for grandeur, for reverence. But no one knew that within the hour, this stage would become the backdrop for a moment that would leave the entire country talking. At the head table, seated front and center, was President Donald Trump. His signature navy suit and red tie were pristine, his posture composed. He was no stranger to high-profile events like this. Yet tonight, there was something different in his demeanor. He sat with a quiet attentiveness, fingers lightly tapping against the polished mahogany table as he listened to the evening's master of ceremonies, a retired four-star general. The general spoke with the seasoned authority of a man who had seen war firsthand. He shared stories of resilience of young men and women who had given more than most could fathom. As he spoke, guests responded with polite nods, some murmuring their approval. But beyond the routine gestures of respect, there was an unspoken truth in the room. Many of these attendees had heard speeches like this before. They had donated, attended memorials, and expressed their gratitude in carefully measured words. It was an expected part of evenings like these. Then, as the general finished his remarks, he paused. A flicker of emotion crossed his face before he cleared his throat and spoke again. "Tonight," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "we have a very special guest. A man who has seen more than most of us could ever imagine and lived to tell about it." The room stilled. Conversations halted. Glasses were set down. Even Trump leaned in slightly, his gaze sharpening. "Ladies and gentlemen," the general continued, "please give a warm welcome to a true American hero, Sergeant James Harlow." And in that moment, the entire energy of the night shifted. The stage was set not just for a speech, not just for another gala tribute, but for something unforgettable. As the applause rippled across the ballroom, James Harlow stepped forward. The man who emerged from the shadows of the stage wasn't a Hollywood celebrity or a polished politician. He was a soldier man who had walked through war and lived to tell about it. At 6'2", his frame was broad, strong, yet there was a quiet stiffness in his movements, the kind that told a deeper story. His gait had a slight limp, almost imperceptible but unmistakable to those who had seen battle. It was a mark left by war, a reminder of what had been taken from him. Dressed in a crisp navy blue suit, James carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had nothing to prove but everything to say. His short-cropped salt and pepper hair and the deep lines etched into his face spoke of years spent under unforgiving desert suns, of moments that changed him in ways no civilian could ever fully understand. As he reached the podium, the applause softened, replaced by an almost eerie silence. This wasn't the polite, obligatory quiet of a formal gathering. This was something heavier. Anticipation. Respect. A room full of powerful people holding their breath, James adjusted the microphone with a steady hand, his fingers briefly brushing against the cold metal stand. He scanned the crowd not with arrogance, not with intimidation, but with the sharp awareness of a man who had spent a lifetime reading situations where life and death hung in the balance. His gaze swept across the room, pausing briefly on faces he recognized: senators, business moguls, military brass, the very people who had made decisions that sent men like him to war. For a long moment, the two men locked eyes. Trump, a man known for his unshakable presence, his commanding nature, did not look away. His fingers, resting on the table, curled slightly, as if bracing for what was to come. Then James took a deep breath and spoke. "I want to thank you all for being here tonight," he said, his voice even, steady. It wasn't the voice of a politician, wasn't rehearsed, wasn't polished for public approval. It was raw, honest. I know these kinds of events are about raising money, showing support, standing behind the men and women who serve this country. But I also know that for a lot of people, it's easy to forget what that really means. A few heads turned, some brows furrowed. James wasn't here to give a generic speech about patriotism. I don't say that with bitterness, he continued, his eyes unwavering. I say it because I've been there. I've seen what war does to men. I've seen what it takes from them. I've seen the ones who never came home. A hush settled over the room, thick and unbreakable. Even the servers who had been quietly refilling glasses had frozen in place, watching. James exhaled slowly. And for a long time, I didn't know how to carry that. He looked down just for a second, as if weighing his next words. When he raised his head again, something shifted in his expression. Until one night, lying in a hospital bed, with more broken bones than I could count and a future that felt uncertain at best, I did the only thing I could do. He paused, and the silence stretched. Then, softly, he said the words that no one in the room expected. James reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, creased piece of paper, the kind of paper that had been folded and unfolded 100 times, its edges softened by time and memory. This isn't a song about me, he clarified, shaking his head. It's about the ones who never got the chance to stand on a stage like this, the ones who never made it past 20, the ones who fought alongside me but never got to come home. He looked toward the corner of the room, where a pianist sat at a gleaming black grand piano. James nodded. The chord filled the air, and then he began to sing. The first notes of the piano faded into the air, settling over the room like a weighted silence. James Harlow gripped the microphone, his knuckles briefly turning white before he loosened his hold. He wasn't nervous. He had faced far worse than a ballroom full of high-profile guests. He took a breath, deep, measured, and then he began. I wasn't always a soldier, he said, his voice steady but carrying an undeniable weight. Before the war, I was just a kid from Georgia, a kid who enlisted because I wanted to serve my country, because I thought I understood what that meant. A few heads tilted, curiosity sparking in their eyes. But war has a way of teaching you lessons that no training, no briefing, no recruitment officer can ever prepare you for. James's gaze drifted over the room, pausing on some of the senators and corporate executives who had supported the war efforts from behind their desks. I remember my first deployment to Iraq, he continued. I was 21. I thought I was invincible. That changed real quick. He let out a dry chuckle, but no one in the room was smiling. We lost our first guy on day 3. He was 19. He barely had stubble on his face. He never got to drink his first legal beer, never got to drive a car without learner plates. But he died wearing a uniform. And for what? The air in the room grew heavier. The clinking of glasses had stopped. Even the waitstaff had stepped back, watching in silence. You see, people talk about war like it's something they can sum up in headlines. Bravery, sacrifice, honor. But what they don't talk about, what they don't want to talk about, is what happens after. James looked down, his fingers briefly brushing the creased paper in his hand. No one tells you about the sound a mother makes when she sees a folded flag instead of her son. No one tells you what it's like to carry your best friend's body through the sand while bullets are still flying past your head. No one tells you how goddamn hard it is to come home and feel like you left the best parts of yourself buried in a place you'll never see again. A woman in the crowd, an older woman with silver-streaked hair, wiped at her eyes with a trembling hand. James nodded slightly, as if acknowledging her grief before he pressed on. I came home after my third tour. I had more scars than I could count, more nightmares than I could explain. And I sat in a hospital bed, wondering if the best thing I'd ever do in my life had already happened, wondering if I'd ever be anything more than the ghosts I carried with me. He took a slow breath, his voice quieter now, but no less powerful. And then, one night, when I couldn't sleep because, let's be real, sleep doesn't come easy when you've seen the things we've seen, I did the only thing I could do. James held up the folded piece of paper, his fingers tracing the worn edges. I wrote a song. A murmur rippled through the audience, not out of doubt, out of pure, stunned curiosity. James smiled, but it wasn't a happy smile. It was the kind of smile that carried years of pain behind it. Not a song about me, he clarified. I don't need people to remember me, but I need them to remember the ones who never came home, the ones whose stories never got told because their voices were silenced too soon. He unfolded the paper slowly, careful, like it was more than just words on a page, like it was a piece of them. I wrote this for them, he said softly. James turned his head slightly, catching President Trump's gaze. For the first time that evening, something flickered in Trump's expression, something unguarded, something real. James gave a small nod, and then he turned back to the microphone. Tonight, I want to share it with you. With a single motion, he signaled to the pianist. The room, already silent, grew impossibly still. And then he began to sing. The first solemn notes of the piano drifted through the ballroom like a whisper from the past. James Harlow closed his eyes for a brief moment, drawing in a slow breath, grounding himself. When he opened them again, his gaze was steady, his posture strong, yet there was an undeniable weight in his expression, the kind carried by a man who had seen too much, lost too much, and yet still stood. Then he began to sing. His voice was deep, rich, yet laced with something raw, something that made the air in the room feel heavier. The words weren't just lyrics. They were stories, etched in pain, in memories that could never be erased. I knew a boy, just 19. He dreamed of home, of grass so green. But the desert took him far away, and home is where he'll never stay. The lyrics floated through the ballroom, but it wasn't just a song, it was a confession, a eulogy, a final goodbye to the ones who never came home. A senator at one of the front tables, an older man, a veteran himself, swallowed hard, blinking rapidly as if trying to push back emotions he wasn't ready to show. A Hollywood actress, draped in a shimmering gown, gripped her napkin tightly, her chest rising and falling with each verse. Trump hadn't moved. He sat rigid, his jaw tight, his hands clasped together on the table in front of him. The usual bravado, the carefully measured expressions he carried in public, were gone. James's voice carried on, unwavering. I see their faces in my dreams, faces on the breeze. But time moves on. Their names fade fast. Tell me, how long will their memory last? A woman in the crowd gasped quietly, covering her mouth with her hand. A man near the back of the room wiped his eyes, unashamed of the tears that had begun to fall. By the second verse, it wasn't just an audience anymore. It was a room of witnesses. They weren't just hearing a song, they were feeling it, living inside every word. And then, the final chorus. James's voice, already carrying so much weight, somehow deepened, as if the words themselves were too heavy to hold. So I sing for those who never got the chance, for the folded flags and last salutes, for the ones who gave all they had to give, so the rest of us could live. The last note hung in the air, stretching through the ballroom, lingering like an unfinished prayer. Then silence came from uncertainty. It was the kind of silence that came when something had changed. James slowly lowered the microphone. He didn't move. He didn't need to. Across the room, shoulders trembled. A single tear traced a path down Trump's cheek. And then, as if breaking free from a spell, the room erupted in thunderous applause. The thunderous applause filled the ballroom, roaring like a wave crashing against the walls. But one man remained seated. Donald Trump hadn't moved. His hands, still clasped together in front of him, had tightened slightly. His usual commanding presence was gone, replaced by something else, something rarely seen in public. His eyes, locked onto James Harlow, were unblinking. His jaw clenched, his breath measured. The cameras in the room captured it all. The President of the United States, a man known for his confidence, his defiance, his unshakable persona, was visibly moved. For the first time that evening, the atmosphere in the room was no longer about status, politics, or prestige. This was about something deeper, something real. Then, slow, deliberately, Trump exhaled. And he stood. Not in the quick, practiced motion of a politician acknowledging a moment, not with the broad grin or the rehearsed nods to the cameras. He rose with weight, with intention, with something that made the entire room hold its collective breath. The applause began to fade, not because it was ending, but because people were watching, waiting. James Harlow stood still at the microphone, his posture firm but his expression unreadable. The two men locked eyes, a silent conversation passing between them that no one else in the room could hear. Then, Trump did something no one expected. He took a step forward. Then another, and another. The weight of the moment grew heavier with each step as the president walked toward the stage. Cameras flashed. The world's most powerful man wasn't just acknowledging the song, he was responding to it. James straightened, his fingers still resting on the mic stand. He had met presidents before. He had stood beside generals, senators, and world leaders. But this was different. Trump reached the edge of the stage, then ascended the steps, not in a rush, not with the urgency of a politician seeking a soundbite. He moved with the careful precision of a man who knew he was walking into history. And when he reached James Harlow, he extended his hand. James hesitated just for a second, not out of doubt, but because he felt the weight of this moment too. Then he gripped Trump's hand, firm, unwavering, a soldier's handshake. But Trump wasn't done. With his free hand, he placed a steady, deliberate palm on James's shoulder. The entire ballroom was silent again, not out of respect, not out of politeness, because no one dared to breathe. And then, in a voice just loud enough for the microphone to catch, Trump spoke. "I heard you." His throat tightening. Trump's grip on his hand tightened slightly, as if to anchor the moment. Then, for the first time all night, Trump's voice softened, not rehearsed, not calculated, but raw. "They'll never be forgotten." A single tear traced a slow path down James's face, but he didn't break. He simply nodded. Trump held his gaze for another long moment, then turned to the audience. His expression had shifted, not softened, but deepened. And then, with deliberate, measured force, he began to clap. The entire room erupted, but this time, it wasn't just applause. It was a standing ovation for every soldier who never got to stand on that stage. The standing ovation was deafening. The applause thundered through the grand ballroom, shaking the very air with its intensity. But even as the audience cheered, some still wiped at their eyes. Others simply stood there, hands pressed together as if still absorbing what they had just witnessed. And the cameras captured all of it. This moment, a president visibly moved, a soldier standing firm, and a song that had silenced a room full of the most powerful people in America was already being transmitted beyond the walls of the Beverly Wilshire Hotel. Within hours, a nation begins to listen. By the time James Harlow stepped off the stage, his phone was already buzzing. text messages, emails, missed calls. One from an old army buddy, short but heavy with meaning. "Damn, man, that hit hard. I needed to hear that." Another from a Gold Star mother. "I never got to hear my son's voice again, but tonight I heard it in yours." The video of his performance exploded online. Clips flooded social media, headlines blared across major news networks. Veteran's song leaves Trump, an entire ballroom in tears. The song that stopped a president in his tracks. No dry eyes in the room. The tribute that America needed. Morning talk shows dissected every frame of the interaction. Pundits argued over what it meant. But for veterans and military families, there was no debate. This was the first time in a long time that their voices had truly been heard. By dawn, news anchors played the clip on repeat. Not just Trump's reaction, not just the applause, but the song. Ordinary happened. Beyond the headlines, a movement is born. Military families across the country began sharing the video. Veterans sent it to old platoon mates. Parents forwarded it to their children in service. High school students watched, silent and wide-eyed, as their history teachers played it in class. The song didn't just go viral. It became a movement. Requests poured in. Veteran organizations, nonprofit groups, and military academies all wanted James to perform. Some asked to use the song in memorial services. Others wanted it played at Arlington, at the tomb of the unknown soldier. James, a man who had never sought the spotlight, suddenly found himself at the center of something far bigger than himself. The White House takes action. Back in Washington, Trump's team was already mobilizing. A senior aide approached the president. "Sir, we need to talk about this song." Trump, still seated at his desk, simply nodded. "I know." For a moment, he didn't say anything. Then, quietly, he made a decision. Make it happen. Within days, the song was being played at military bases across the United States. The Department of Veterans Affairs reached out to James, requesting permission to use it in their outreach programs for soldiers suffering from PTSD. Pentagon got involved. A week later, James Harlow found himself standing in the Oval Office, face to face with the president once again. Trump leaned forward, eyes locked onto him. "This isn't just a song, Sergeant. It's a message, and it's time the whole damn country hears it." James didn't flinch. He simply nodded. And that was when he knew this was bigger than one night. A song that refused to be forgotten. Veterans who had once felt invisible now had a voice. Families who had lost loved ones now had a tribute. An America country often divided, often caught up in politics, and Neustadt found something to unite behind. Because in the end, this wasn't just about music. It was about honor, sacrifice, remembrance. And no one who heard that song would ever forget it. In the days that followed, James Harlow's life changed forever. His phone never stopped ringing calls from veterans, military families, complete strangers who had seen the video and felt something they hadn't in years. Some just wanted to say thank you. Others shared their own stories of loss, of brothers, fathers, and sons who had never made it home. James read every message. One in particular made his hands tremble. It was from Marjorie Tillman, the mother of Private Jason Tillman, of the men James had served with in Afghanistan, one of the men who hadn't come home. "Wait of a lifetime. I never got to hear my son's voice again, but last night, I heard it in your song." James sat in silence for a long time after reading it. He had spent years carrying the memories of the fallen, but now, he realized he wasn't carrying them alone anymore. The invitation that changed everything. A few days later, his inbox held another message. Not from a journalist, not from a politician, but from a small nonprofit in Nashvilleian organization that helped veterans tell their stories through music. "James Harlow, your song has moved this nation. If you're willing, we'd love for you to work with us to help others find their voice the way you found yours." James stared at the screen. He had never considered himself a musician. He had never seen himself as a performer, but maybe, just maybe, this was what he was meant to do. A song becomes a movement. A week after the gala, James stood on a small stage in a packed American Legion Hall in Texas. The crowd was different from Beverly Wilshire, fewer tuxedos, more uniforms worn threadbare with time. Veterans, families, Gold Star mothers. James stepped up to the microphone. This time, he didn't have to introduce himself. They already knew who he was. He unfolded the same creased piece of paper, the one he had carried for years, and placed it on the stand. "This song," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "was never meant to be about me. It's about all of us. It's about them." Then he nodded toward the pianist. And for the second time, he sang. This time there were no cameras, no politicians, no flashing lights. Just the people who understood. And when the last note faded into the air, an older man in the front row, a veteran from the Vietnam War, slowly stood and raised his hand in a crisp salute. A moment later, another veteran followed. Then another, until the entire room stood not clapping, not cheering, but saluting. James swallowed hard, nodded once, and stepped back. Because he knew, in that moment, no soldier is ever truly gone, as long as their story is told. A month later, James sat in a small apartment in Nashville, Tennessee. His guitar leaned against the wall. His laptop was open, a half-written song glowing on the screen. Taken a lot from him, but it had also given him something he never expected: a mission beyond the battlefield. A notification flashed across his phone. Another message from a veteran. Another story waiting to be told. James picked up his guitar, strummed a few chords, and took a deep breath. He had work to do, because now he understood. His fight wasn't over, and no one would be forgotten. This story isn't just about one soldier, one song, or one moment. It's about remembrance, gratitude, and action. Too often we say we support our troops, but how often do we truly listen to their stories? How often do we reach out to a veteran, not just on Veterans Day, but on an ordinary Tuesday, to ask how they're doing? Heroes don't always wear capes, they wear uniforms, they bear scars, and sometimes they carry wounds that aren't visible. So, here's the challenge. Don't just watch. Do something. Reach out to a veteran. Ask about their story. Listen. Support organizations that help veterans transition back to civilian life. If you know a soldier struggling, remind them they are not alone. Because remembering their sacrifice isn't enough, we must honor it with action. Now, tell us if you ever had a moment that changed the way you see our veterans. Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story moved you, hit like, subscribe, and share it, because sometimes the greatest tribute we can give is simply remembering